As marketing leaders, we are so often forced to market to anyone with a pulse, so that way we can expand our target market. Conversely, how often do we hear that we need to be more exclusive to increase margin and drive demand? Which school of thought is actually right? Marketing and sales are full of myths, misconceptions, and sometimes even flat-out lies. Join us as we leave the echo chamber and discern which path is best for us.
Hello and welcome to the Rethink Marketing Podcast, where we try to understand and share the pros and cons of today's marketing advice. I'm Paul Frodge, joined by Mr. Marketing, and for today's conversation, the exciting executor of accelerating exclusivity, Colin Jeffries. Colin, how are we doing today?
Man, Paul, that was one heck of an alliteration. I feel about as good as a one-person marketing team that just got approval to make a second hire. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I love getting that opportunity to have another hire, don't you?
Oh my gosh. Especially I think of all the hats that a one-man marketing show has to wear. And when they're able to bring somebody else in and do a little more of the things that they're best at and offload some of the things that they're maybe not as good at or cover some of the weaknesses they have, that's always a win.
Absolutely. Usually when you bring in that second person, they bring a multitude of great ideas and expertise for sure.
Absolutely. So Paul, what is it that we are rethinking today?
Colin, today we are actually looking at how marketers are often advised to create exclusivity and how to increase market share, but how do we balance the paradox of both without the risk of doing neither? So let's get into this.
Yeah, Paul, this is a really interesting topic in my opinion, because I've heard multiple stories recently about brands creating exclusivity and being extremely successful. So we think about Sunseeker, Virtuoso, Rolex, Four Seasons Hotels, Ferrari as a couple of sort of poster children for these highly exclusive and successful brands. And just to be clear, exclusive does not necessarily mean expensive. Usually it means something like limited availability that is driving up price. For example, I think of like a Pappy Van Winkle 15-year bourbon. It's extremely hard to find, which makes it very expensive. It's not necessarily just very expensive, which makes it very rare, if that makes sense. On the flip side of this, we have these national brands that pretty much cater to anybody. So you think about Netflix, Amazon, McDonald's, Kia, Holiday Inn, Starbucks, right? Any of these brands that are really going for mass market. There's nothing exclusive about Netflix. There's really nothing exclusive about Kia, right? They're looking at how do we just grow our market and increase revenue. I don't think either of these models is wrong. What's wrong and what marketers often miss on is we start in one area and then we try to shift over to the other area. And I think that's my word of caution here with rethinking this advice is if you are in one camp and you stay in that one camp, it's very likely that you'll be very successful. If you try to bridge the gap going between being exclusive and then being mass market, that's where a lot of marketers get caught up and we don't do either one very well. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I agree. When you talk about Netflix, I look at that as an opportunity for a tiered offering and having multiple packages. Yeah, it's not exclusive from a monetary standpoint. If somebody doesn't want to pay for the ads or they do want to pay for the ads or can't afford the ads, looking at it that way is, being able to take that good, better, best approach, value-based pricing, and looking at it as, okay, I'm going to pay for a subscription for a streaming service, for example, and looking at that as it's not really exclusive. It's just a preference based on what the consumer would like to see.
That's a great point too. We have to definitely consider consumer preferences. What we don't want to do is come out with something that's super exclusive. I think Sunseeker's a really good example, right? They come out with these super luxury yachts. They're not going to sell very many of those. So what do they have to do? Well, build in enough margin that on the few that they sell, they can run a profitable business. And I think the same thing is definitely true when we're looking at market demand. When we step in and we say, hey, there's some demand for X, so then there's some demand for a luxury, exclusive, rare version of X. How do we get in and serve that market if there's actually demand there? And I think we can do a lot to pressure test that. One example would just be looking at competitors. And are they serving middle market? Are they serving lower market? Is there a rush to the bottom? Or are there a couple that are serving the hyper luxury version of whatever service we're trying to offer? The most clear example of that would likely be, I would say, fashion, where you can go anywhere and you can buy a shirt for $1 or a 3-pack maybe, or you can then go buy a shirt for tens of thousands of dollars and everything in between. It's pretty easy to look at that and think, okay, now we just have to go in and we have to position ourselves, brand ourselves. And then the thing that matters the most, in my opinion, is actually servicing the market. So often we see brands where they come in and they think, okay, we're going to pivot from the mass market version to the luxury version. Auto manufacturers, classic example of this, where they actually rolled out a separate brand. We think about Honda and Acura, where Honda doesn't have a low-level line and then a luxury line. They have Hondas, which are intended to be more mass market, slightly premium, I would argue. And then their quote unquote luxury version, their exclusive version that is under a totally different flagship. So all that to say, and I realize that was a little rambly, but all that to say, I think we have to be really cognizant of this level of service that we're providing. We can't come in and expect to be the best of the best and the most premium and the most luxury and also be mass market. We have to really differentiate and say our positioning is X, our branding is Y, and then we're going to come in and we're going to serve that market. And if we're going to be exclusive and if we're going to be hard to find and if we're going to be luxury and premium and all this other stuff, then maybe we need a separate brand, even if the offering's a little bit similar. Paul, what do you think?
Totally agree. Same with Toyota or Lexus, and we can go all the way down the line with the auto manufacturers for sure. It's that segmentation of brands and trying to figure out, okay, maybe different personas or different types of audiences that we're going to be branding and marketing to, and looking at that as an opportunity to say, okay, the exclusive line is XYZ, and then looking at another opportunity to still serve the mass market and being able to really broaden the opportunity and not be so exclusive for sure.
Definitely. And part of that is, what do we want as an organization? Is our goal just more revenue? Because if it's revenue, we can accomplish that a couple of different ways. To your point, we can have an offering that serves a ton of people at a smaller margin, or we can have an offering that serves a very small number of people at an extremely high margin. So there are lots of ways we can accomplish the same revenue. It's interesting, Paul. I was talking to a small business owner a couple of months ago, and he made the point that in a peer group of other small business owners, there was a coach that recommended that they increase their prices 50%. And he said, what will happen is you'll lose 50% of your customers, but you'll actually increase your revenue because you'll start to get customers that are placing bigger orders, that are more reliable when they're working with you, that pay on time. You sort of lose the quote unquote riffraff of customers that you really didn't want to serve anyway. When you race to the bottom for being the cheapest, you pick up a lot of those people that are bargain hunters and they're one-off shoppers and those sorts of things. But when you increase your pricing, you lose all of those people. So yeah, you lose the revenue, but you actually get more revenue from the customers that you're serving. So an interesting perspective on exclusivity. And I realize we've talked a lot about pricing, and I don't want to get caught up in pricing equals exclusivity, because we talk in economics about supply and demand. Supply is what actually creates exclusivity if we're managing that supply really well.
Yeah. So another thing to think about with this is looking at a limited supply or that scarcity opportunity with brands as well to create that exclusivity. It's a one of a kind. We've talked about that in previous podcasts, looking at the opportunity for, oh my gosh, I am the perfect target audience for this, and I really want this. The Pappy example that you mentioned earlier is a definite opportunity that Buffalo Trace uses with their marketing as well. Is the overflow of Pappy Van Winkle actually goes into one of the Weller bottles. So, looking at that is, that's still Pappy, but those that really want it and are maybe a collector item, or the opportunity for the retail value of that Pappy bottle is much less than if it's in an auction for a fundraiser, for example, where it could go for $1,500 to $3,000 a bottle. So it's interesting when you think about the limited supply and the demand for it.
Great point, Paul. One thing that I'll add to that is this can't be just a marketing decision. product, operations, the executive team, of course, your sales team, if there is one, etc. Everyone has to be involved in this decision. And typically it's made by founders very early. I think about Warby Parker when they came in and they said, we are going to be the mass market brand for eyewear. And they've expanded their service lines and all sorts of stuff. But really, when they started, it was the founders that put a stake in the ground, staked their claim, I guess, and they said, we're going to be mass market. And it's worked out very well for them. Conversely, I think about Barclay Prime in Philadelphia, a luxury, very exclusive steakhouse, and they came out with the $100 Philly cheesesteak, which sounds ridiculous. And it was a bit of a PR play, but it's a very exclusive and delicious luxury type sandwich that they're serving. But they're really coming out and they're saying, hey, we're going to be super luxury. We're going to be very exclusive. There are a limited number of seats. We have to make good margin on these seats. So it's going to be expensive. We have to tell people and tailor their expectations that it's going to be an expensive but enjoyable experience. So from the get-go, it's a lot easier than pivoting later on, is what I would say. Pivoting can be done, but it's just very challenging.
I would agree with that. And looking at also loyalty programs, I'd like to throw that in there as an opportunity too, where you talk about exclusivity. It's an audience that is highly engaged. They are looking at, whether it be the social emails, the influencers possibly for the brand, and really partaking in being part of that audience that that brand is marketing to, and wanting to be part of this small opportunity for being part of that overall experience for sure.
Absolutely. Paul, you've done a good job bringing up audience a couple of times. And I think that's something that's really important, is knowing what our audience wants. And if it's not what our current audience wants, understanding what target market we want to pursue, and then what that target market, what that audience, what that ideal customer really, really does want. Well, Paul, this has been a fun conversation, pretty lively, I think. A couple of opinions have come out, which is great. Talking about whether we want to be exclusive, which does not just mean expensive, or whether we want to be mass market, which doesn't necessarily mean cheap. I think about Starbucks as a really good example. They're not cheap, but they are everywhere.
Colin, I would argue that Starbucks is expensive, especially when you have two teenage daughters that are constantly adding money from my credit card to the app and going there multiple times a week for sure.
Absolutely. Starbucks is a great example of being expensive, but not exclusive. And they've done a good job of serving the mass market and having really strong margins. But think about it, anybody that can afford it can walk into a Starbucks because they're so prolific, and they can buy their mocha latte cappuccino, if that's a thing. Another great example would be BMW, where they sort of build themselves as being luxury and exclusive. But if you actually look at buying a BMW, they'll sell a BMW to anybody, but they won't necessarily sell a Lamborghini or a Ferrari to everybody. Ferrari tends to be the sort of pinnacle of this luxury, hard to get, difficult to find type of brand. Very, very expensive. So let's not get caught up in the expense part of it, because again, to your point, Paul, Starbucks, expensive, mass market; Ferrari, expensive, but luxury and exclusive. And we've talked about Pappy Van Winkle and some other things too here, where they're not necessarily expensive. Sure, they mostly are because of the supply and demand element of things, the controlled supply, I should say. But exclusive means a lot more than just expensive. I don't think that there's one solution that fits every business, obviously. I would recommend, and what I've seen work really well, is that we pick one and we really stick with it, because changing from mass market to luxury or to exclusive takes a long time and it's very expensive. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today on the Rethink Marketing Podcast. Until next week, keep rethinking those common assumptions and the importance of being exclusive or mass market. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If people want to connect with us, where should they go, Paul?
RethinkMarketingPodcast.com, Colin. What can listeners do to help us in return for the sage marketing wisdom and our pithy humor?
They can help us by leaving a review on their favorite platform or sharing this episode with a fellow marketer to help them cut through the clutter.
Well, until next time, keep rethinking those common assumptions.